Well, it is really a pleasure to be speaking with Joyce Vance today. Her new book is Giving Up Is Unforgivable, a manual for keeping a democracy. It's such a great, not great, it's an important time to be talking. It's great to be talking at an important time, but it is not necessarily a great time in the sense of a lot of the things that we're following. I really do appreciate your time, though.
It's really nice to be with you. And it's funny, I was just thinking about what you're saying because I had said to somebody, oh, I really enjoyed that conversation. But enjoy was the wrong word, right? I mean, it was a sort of a dark conversation about the political moment, but it felt good coming out of it to have had the conversation and to have shared ideas with somebody. So I think we can all be forgiven for that loose of the word enjoyed.
Well, listen, I think one place to start that might be really relevant to my audience, that is an audience that, is more steeped in politics than the average person, I would say. And I've been very honest with my audience that even personally, I think there are limits to how much of this stuff is healthy to consume, that I think it's good. When I'm done with my last show of the week, I really try to not engage with what's happening for a couple of days, which I know is a privileged thing to be able to do, but it's really a mental health thing. And one of the things I saw that you mentioned in a recent book chat that you did is that we can't be outraged all the time. And there's a couple of different layers where I think that is important. And what I would love for you to do is to talk about it, but also contrast it with one of the things we're fighting is getting too used to the absurd things that are happening. And so on the one hand, not everything can be a scandal. We can't be outraged all the time. And also, we don't want to fall into a situation where any of what's going on is accepted as normal. So, can you talk a little bit about how those two things can both be true?
I think you just said all of the smart, important things all at once and connected them in a way I've never really connected them before. Because I think this sense of overwhelm that we all feel, right? That's my new noun for the day, overwhelm. It's deliberate. This is a strategy that wannabe dictators use in order to get people just to give up because they just feel beyond the ability to cope with it. And like you say, for mental health purposes, maybe need to just check out for a while just to stay on an even keel. At the same time, outrage fatigue is real. And if you just think back to the first time that you, for instance, saw ICE attack a person on American streets and how horrified you were, and we're still horrified, but every time we see it, it's a little bit less. We're watching these attacks that the administration is launching, what the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, calls kinetic attacks, which are extrajudicial murders of human beings. And it's hard to sustain the outrage on time 15 or 16. I think that's really the challenge that we face. How do we stay involved and engaged in what's going on? How do we do it without becoming sanguine about what we're seeing and accepting it as the new normal? And so that's one part of the value that I've found in these Substack conversations, maybe with folks that I don't know and with new audiences, is for us all to have the chance to observe what's going on through fresh eyes, to make sure that we maintain the outrage. We should all be righteously indignant right now. I mean, it's hard to sit in my basement, but simultaneously jump up and down and demand answers from my Republican senators. So we all have to figure out how to do that. We also need to take care of ourselves and remember that the reason that we're doing this is because democracy is not some abstract goal. It's a system that lets us live good, happy, productive lives and make our own decisions, not to have a king or a dictator who tells us what we can and can't do. So our challenge is to do all of that at once.
One of the challenges I've been thinking about a lot is, especially as there is, I would say, some fracturing on the left. I don't want to overplay and say there's this civil war. I also don't want to pretend that the left is as united as it's ever been, because I certainly don't think that that's the case. But in a context where there are certainly factions on the left right now, one of the things that seems mathematically correct to me is that, given that 40 to 50% of the country doesn't vote, depending on what election we're talking about, I see a bigger opportunity in activating people not currently voting by connecting what they're worried about in their communities to who they vote for, then getting into the rage debate scenarios of the intra-left fighting. The latter may be entertaining. There's a lot of shows and YouTube channels built around that kind of debate. But I actually think the bigger opportunity is in this mass of people, tens of millions of people, who have not come to believe that they might be able to better their circumstances if they did engage with the political process. Now, every election cycle, as you know, you hear, if we can just increase turnout among 18 to 29-year-olds by 2%, we win everything. And of course, like, it just ends up coming down to the 7 swing states every election, and it's close. And so I guess my question is, what is your sense now of the best way to activate these tens of millions of non-voters?
This is a really great question. I mean, the numbers don't lie, right? If more young people voted, and if they voted what I think we generally perceive as for progressive policies, then maybe we wouldn't have a President Donald Trump. Maybe we would have a president who cared about climate change, or a president who cared about civil rights, or what have you. So look, I think a big part of this issue is persuading people that voting matters. I mean, that's canon in my household, right? We deeply get, because my husband is an elected state court judge. We both come from families that had different levels of involvement in the political process and the civil rights movement. We get that voting is incredibly powerful, and that nobody would try to take your right to vote away as hard as these folks are doing if it wasn't really powerful. But I have a 22-year-old kid, and we were talking about what would it take to motivate you to, well, this was me as his mom fishing. What would it take to get you to read a book about democracy? Because, you want your kid to read your book. And he just sort of yawned. And we had this interesting conversation that I recite part of in the book, where he said, Mom, I was 4 years old when Occupy happened. And nothing has changed. Rich people still control government. They control Congress. They control caucuses. I'm a 22-year-old kid. What exactly is it that you expect me to do against billionaire and billionaire adjacent people? And I think that that's a really legitimate point of view. And if we're going to activate younger voters or people who feel disenfranchised by the political process, then we need to share with them the story of times that government worked, because they don't remember those times. I mean, my kid, his earliest memories of a presidency, Donald Trump's first term in office. He maybe has shadowy memories of Obama and happy times, but that's not what he's grown up with. And so I think we need to tell the stories, and I do in the book, of the civil rights movement and of times when voters went out in the streets to demand their rights, and then change became possible. But we got to make that concrete. You can't expect people to go out and vote based on ideas, not on benefits in their own lives.
Do you, or to what degree do you also think that kind of understanding the pace of progress historically is relevant? And I'll contextualize what I mean by that. In my book, I had a chapter on basically why I am not an accelerationist. I believe in incrementalism. And the reason I say that is when I look at the 3 eras of the biggest progressive advancements, which I identified as the progressive era, the New Deal era, the civil rights era. At the time, it sort of seemed slow. But when we look back and we realize, a lot of it depended on who had won a prior election and who were the new Supreme Court justices that were in on the Supreme Court at what ended up being critical times. I try to build up this case that it can feel slow, but we are hopefully building on something. Do you think that there's not enough of an understanding of sometimes, like, we want things to happen fast, and in retrospect, it will be fast, but in the moment, it can sort of feel slow?
Yeah, I mean, we're a fast society, right? I mean, in 30 minutes of TV, including commercial breaks, a crime is supposed to be committed and solved on Law and Order, and that's how the
Right.
world is supposed to work. I think the point that you make in your book is the right point. And the civil rights era illustrates this in some very interesting ways, right? There's the integration of the University of Alabama, where I teach, over the objection of the governor, George Wallace, who stood in the schoolhouse doorway very dramatically and then stepped aside because President Kennedy had made it impossible for him to continue to stand there successfully. And so we see the integration of the university, and there's a woman named Vivian Malone Jones who becomes the first Black student to be enrolled. Someone someone with great credentials who would have been accepted in a race-neutral environment, but they found excuses like the class size won't allow it or some other BS like that to keep her out. But she enrolls. And she doesn't have an easy path. There's a lot of opposition. There are bombs that go off. She tells a story in an interview, right, that one day she decides to go to class even though there's been a bombing right by her apartment that day because the moment demands it of her. And in her wake, lots of students, Black students, enroll at the University of Alabama. There's even a Black student government president, something that was unthinkable, in my lifetime. And 50 years later, when the university holds the celebration of the anniversary of integration, the sitting attorney general, Eric Holder, the first Black attorney general, is Vivian Malone Jones' brother-in-law. So there's this sort of straight line of progress that's elusive in the moment, especially when the times are tough and it's difficult and you feel like progress isn't linear, which it never was in the civil rights movement. It was a step forward and two back and then go forward again. But it's that long sweep of history that's instructive. So at the risk of sounding like a professor, which I am in real life, I'll just say we sometimes have to look at the video, not the snapshot, to understand why incrementalism, even when it's frustrating, is the right approach.
In the kind of theme of the book of not giving up, one of the things I've sort of done content about and written about a little bit is that there are some structural realities in the country that implicitly sort of resist mass protest and mass action. And kind of what I mean by that is when healthcare is for most people linked to their job, when wages have been stagnant and 40% of the country would have to borrow to meet an unexpected $400 expense, when public transit or train transit is very underdeveloped, you put all of these things together, and it's both like kind of difficult and risky for the average person to take time off from work to go and protest. This is great for these structures that don't want people protesting, that don't want our financial system grinding to a halt, et cetera. So I'm interested in kind of hearing your thoughts about whether those structural hindrances to mass protests need to be dealt with first, or whether it's part of what the protest would try to change, or like, how do you conceive of that?
It would be great if we had the luxury of fixing all of the problems that you've just identified right now. The reality is we don't. I mean, we have to first run the race for democracy and then fix the problems. And as you point out, there are a lot of interests that de-incentivize fixing all of those problems. Look, if you're a young single mom and you're a waitress, or you have a job where you eat what you kill, you only eat if you earn money, you can't afford to take a day off of work. But one of the lessons of the civil rights movement, so I live in Birmingham. I've had this amazing opportunity to talk with foot soldiers over the years. And one of the lessons that you learn is the importance of being in community and realizing you do not have to fight the entire fight on your own. And if you can't afford to stay home from work, don't. But that means that those of us who are in a position to go out and protest absolutely have to. And there's a moment in the fight for civil rights in Alabama where parents are being threatened with loss of their jobs if they protest. And so we get the school children's march, where children, I mean, like young kids, high school kids, march out of their schools and protest on the streets in Birmingham. And that leads to this sort of famous moment with Bull Connor and dogs and fire hoses. And much of that animates the rest of the country in the belief that something has got to change. I hope it won't take a traumatic moment like that one, but I do think that there's value in understanding that not everybody has to do everything. But those of us who can do certain things have an obligation to do them right now.
Yeah, interestingly a very similar message to what Heather Cox Richardson kind of suggested when I had her on a couple of months ago. And it's a very interesting one and an important one that I think resonates with a lot of people. Uh, how significant do you think the divisions on what we would loosely call the political left are right now? Because I could steelman both cases, right? I could say, listen, you've got corporate centrist Democrats who seem very interested in maintaining the status quo and the systems that got them into power. and treading very lightly in order to get themselves reelected. Cool. On the other side, you've got accelerationists and actual socialists, not people that are called socialists as a pejorative, but actual socialists who are happy to try to burn down systems with the belief that they can build them back up in a better way. And then in between, you've got a bunch of stuff. Like, I'm a social democrat in the style of like Denmark and Sweden, and I believe in well-regulated capitalism that ensures that standards of living don't go too low, and we use taxes to, okay. How serious are these divisions in your mind?
So look, Democrats have always been the party of a big tent. I'm a lawyer. I'm a former federal prosecutor, not a political theorist, but I've been around long enough to know that the only way this country works is if we build coalitions among people who don't see 100% eye to eye. And if we're willing to do something that's become all but unheard of in our politics, which is to compromise. And the hope is that if we do that, we can certainly do better than what we're seeing on the other side of the aisle, right? At this moment. I mean, if you don't see this as a moment where you have to, in many ways, put country ahead of party or ahead of faction, then I think all hope is lost in this country. And it's instructive to me to think about how much of the divide on the left, but really even the wedge between Republicans and Democrats, has been driven by, let's just say, outside interests that are invested in seeing this country fail. So a lot of the disinformation and even the misinformation that we see online and in social media is designed to fail, was designed to elect a particular presidential candidate. And I think if we study that sort of behavior, which is well documented, at least online, then it helps us understand that the people who have interests in dividing us are not people who have any of our best interests at heart. And so my daughter, who I think is pretty far to the left of you and maybe among that group of people who are true believers in socialism, she nonetheless said, I don't love Kamala Harris. I know you do, Mom. I'm going to vote for her because I think she's the best choice. And it's a binary choice, right? It's not my perfect world versus what's on the other side. And so we do need to, I think, quell enough of the divide to address that. But at the same time, it's not enough for people who have been in power for a long time to continue to ride on that, to coast on that, and to refuse to have conversations with people who see things differently. And, a lot of the time when we all sit down at the table and discuss ideas, our ideas evolve and they're better and they're stronger. Socialism on the model in the Scandinavian countries where people have great educations and get good health care and have good quality of life, there's no reason we shouldn't be exploring what we can import from that into our system. And in an area that I work in that's near and dear to my heart, which is prison reform. We can absolutely learn from other countries. And it's ridiculous that we insist on having prisons where the model is house people, warehouse people like animals, and then send 98% out of them back into the community and expect good results. So I would say, let's get through the moment that we're in, but let's not forget that on the other side of it, there's a responsibility for people to listen to other people and to really fulfill the sort of, the big tent moniker instead of just paying lip service to it. Sorry, I know
Very,
that
very
sort of
well said.
rambled, but I think it's a
No,
complicated issue.
it's complicated. No, but that I think is very well said and really lays out the stakes very, very accurately. The book is Giving Up Is Unforgivable, a manual for keeping a democracy. And we've been speaking with the book's author, Joyce Vance. Get the book, subscribe to Joyce's Substack. If you're one of Joyce's viewers, I'd be flattered if you subscribe to my Substack. And I so appreciate your time, and I hope to do it again.
This has been great. Let's do it anytime you want to. I mean, I think this is exactly the kind of conversation we should all be having right now.
Thank you so much. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Bye.